let's review another edge case, also related to stopwatch component. So here is the problem. If I'm gonna start tracking the time for a particular activity, and then we'll close the tab with an application, and after some period of time I'll come back to the application again, the time that was passed while our application was inactive will not be added to the total amount of tracked time. So basically that past time will be gone. And here is an example. If I'll start tracking the time for coding activity, and let's say I'll close this application when the stopwatch reaches 5 seconds. And then I'll wait for about 5 seconds while being on another page, and then come back to our application. As we can see, the stopwatch starts counting from the 5 seconds. So those additional 5 seconds that have passed while we were being on a different page are gone. So let's figure out the way how we can fix it and actually include idle time to the total amount of tracked seconds. Let's go inside storage.js, and in this function load state, firstly I'm going to extract the date when our application was last active into the constant last active at. And by the way, let's also rename this key date on last active at, because this key stores the date when our application was last active. So we're gonna have to rename this key right before we save the state of our application to local storage right here. And now let's get back to the function load state. So right here I'm going to pass this date last active at into isToDate function to determine whether our application was last active today. And before actually working with timeline item resource, I'll firstly assign all activity objects read from the local storage to activities reactive variable. And after that, we can start handling timeline items objects. So in order to add those idle seconds that have passed since our application was last active up until the next time when our application will be opened, we're going to use function sync idle seconds that we are going to define next. So in here, let's declare this function, which is going to receive two parameters, timeline items array, as well as the date last active at. And once again, this is the date of the last time our application was active. The first thing we're going to do in this function is actually find active timeline item object. Let's call method find on this array to find active timeline item by checking the key is active, and if one of these keys will be true, that means that we have found active timeline item. Because there is no point to add those idle seconds if none of our stopwatches were running before we have closed the application. But if we were able to find the active timeline item, here I'm gonna use if conditional, and inside we have to add idle seconds to the total amount of tracked seconds that were tracked right before we have closed the application. So we have to modify property activity seconds of active timeline item object by simply adding those past seconds. And the way we can do this is basically by subtracting the date of the last time our application was active from current date. And eventually this expression will return us amount of milliseconds passed since we have last time used the application. And then to turn this amount of milliseconds into seconds, we have to divide this value by amount of milliseconds in 1 second. And this value is stored in the constant milliseconds in second. So I'm going to divide the result by milliseconds in second constant, like so. And this way an active timeline item object will be modified and will contain those amount of seconds passed since our application was last active. And then the timeline items array with the modified timeline item object will be assigned to timeline items reactive variable. And just to see if our calculations are correct, I'm going to print out the result of this whole expression in a console. And now let's check it out. But firstly, let's make sure if our latest change to the state of our application, which is renaming the key date on last active at, took effect. And indeed, we can see this key with the new name. So now let's do the same testing steps that we have done at the beginning of this lesson, which is tracking the time for a particular activity. And once stopwatch reaches 5 seconds, I'm going to switch to a different page, wait for about 5 seconds, and then come back to our application. And this time we're supposed to see that those 5 seconds should be added to the total amount of tracked seconds that were present before we quit the application. In this case, we're seeing 11 seconds because I was on a different page for 6.6 seconds, as we can see. And this amount of seconds has been added to the total amount of tracked seconds, just like we want. So now let's go back to the editor and remove this temporary console log statement. The link to the source code of this application, as always, will be in the video description.